Colorverse C Europa cold open. Nope, not using that joke. Not that one either. Ugh, no, skip that one. Why are all these cold open jokes about fish? This is another one of those reviews where I had to write everything else before circling back around for this intro. And there's two reasons for it, and yes, Colorverse is definitely to blame. First thing, look at that bottle art. Look at it. They put a fish on there, and I know what they were getting at, but if you make a pinkish red ink with a fish on the logo, all I'm gonna do is think about salmon, and nothing good comes of that. The second is that as I was looking up the namesake of this ink, I was looking at the non-color enhanced pictures of Europa. So for a good chunk of the review process, I just wasn't seeing the tones on display that Colorverse put into this ink. Just go to the Wikipedia page for Europa, and you'll see a good picture of the side-by-side of the non-enhanced versus the enhanced look at this Galilean moon. Once I forced myself to get past those two things though, the roller coaster with this ink continued for a few other reasons. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into those now. Looking at the ink blot, it's a little safe to say that I'm being a little hard on this ink by saying that it only has one color at play. If anything, the ink blot shows that this ink has hints of coral, cognac, maroon, and various other shades of reds. One color I will not call this ink though is pink. Well, okay, except for in those lighter portions. The light tones are definitely a faded pink. The lighter mids hit on coral and salmon tones, and the darker mids and transitions in the middle definitely hit on a maroon and cognac feel. And I guess the longer I look at it, I guess I can say that it looks close to the enhanced color pictures of Europa. Now, let's take a look at those other performance indicators. Dry time is definitely a tale of two papers here. At least from a broad nib, that is. On Tomoe, this one is pretty bad at over 30 seconds to dry, but once we switch over to Rhodia, that dry time goes down to a more reasonable 20 to 25 seconds. It's still not what I would consider to be a workplace safe performance, but at least on Rhodia, it does come back into the realm of daily multi-page journaling. Now with this ink reminding me of a salmon, I'm really hoping for some good water performance. As we get water on the page, I can already see that I'm not going to get the same performance that we saw from Redwood Forest. Looking through the water and at the paper, I can already see a good amount of color lift. Once the water is off the page though, I can at least say that I'm not disappointed. The overall performance is still good and still usable in a spill situation. If anything, with how the color lifted, it made for a cleaner underlayer. And yeah, that underlayer is still pretty easy to see. Now, before we take a look at the writing samples, did you ever wonder why these videos tend to be less than 8 minutes long? Well, simply put, it's to avoid those mid-roll ads that we all hate. But it does come at a cost. So if you want to help keep these reviews concise and mid-roll ads out of the content, consider becoming a patron. Doing so will give you early access to these reviews and provide you with the satisfaction of knowing that you are providing treats for my dogs. And hey, who doesn't want that? Moving on to the writing samples, let's start this week with Rhodia. Color-wise, this isn't a bad-looking ink. From a broad nib, we are getting a good look at the darker mid-tones, and there is the occasional flirting with the lighter red shades as well. One thing you can see as I'm writing here is that this is a fairly wet ink, though I will not quite say lubricated. Flow is definitely there once you get this ink going, but getting it going, especially if the pen has been left uncapped, is a bit of a hit or miss affair. You can also see that even though we are getting pools of ink on the page, that the line width is occasionally dipping down into the medium nib range. So on Rhodia, it is safe to call this one consistently inconsistent with a pretty good amount of dynamic range. And with the dry time being between 20 and 25 seconds here, that dynamic range is actually somewhat confusing. If anything, I would expect to see this ink camping in the darker mids with no mention of the lighter tones. I'm definitely glad though that this isn't the case, but what about over on Tomoe? Well, the story is kind of the same, with the exception of when you just start writing on TR, the ink shifts more towards those darker mids and transition tones. Those initial sentences though, will at least see some of the lighter shades come through. It's also pretty easy to see where that 30-second plus dry time comes into play. The pools of ink on the paper as I'm writing are definitely sticking around for a longer period of time, and dynamic range is also slightly choked off when compared to the performance over on Rhodia. Don't get me wrong, this is still a pretty good dynamic range, but I feel like I'm forced to switch over to print writing in order to get the same level of dynamics that just come across out of the pen over on Rhodia. I will say though, if you are okay with writing one page at a time before being forced to take a break, or you can be satisfied with the smooth dark cognac and maroon tones coming from this ink, then it's okay. But for me though, I think it's going to be a hard pass. It feels like a really bad attempt at Papier Plume red beans and rice. And yeah, that's going to go ahead and do it for our look at Colorverse C Europa. If you liked that review or found it useful, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.